fully, and do apologise again for absenting myself before the wind-up speeches.
Patrick Harvie, followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. In looking at the Government's progress report on economic recovery, on the first sentence of it, I do find something that I can agree with, where the Government says that from day one in office it has been clear about its central purpose being based on sustainable economic growth. I agree that the Government has been very clear in setting that objective, but I think that it has been unclear in explaining what it means. It's the latest in a series of verbal tricks. First we had economic growth, then economic development, sustainable economic development, and now sustainable economic growth. Each of these verbal tricks attempts over the years to distract us from the fundamental question in the modern economy: can everlasting growth be sustained on a planet of finite resources? Now, every other political party in this chamber so far remains, at least formally, committed to arguing that it can be. Growth forever, growth everlasting, and despite the linguistic gymnastics used to imply otherwise, growth which is to be pursued regardless of the social and environmental impacts. For decades, a vision of everlasting growth based on consumerism, and conspicuous consumerism, has been pursued by governments around the world of all mainstream political persuasions, leading to a society in which people are encouraged by a torrent of advertising to judge their worth as human beings on the basis of how much stuff they consume. Well, the recession should be taken as a hard lesson about the meaning of unsustainable economics. Debt piled upon debt, transactions spiralling out of all proportion with the value of goods and services produced in the real world, patterns of production and consumption hideously mismatched to people's actual needs, and a handful of individuals growing obscenely wealthy, playing at masters of the universe. Some of us have been arguing for years that the prevailing economic model, which left half the world too thin, half the world too fat, and vital natural resources plundered and squandered, was doomed to fail. So the question is, does economic recovery mean resurrecting that failed model or finding something new? Mr Swinney, the Cabinet Secretary, describes a transition. In his speech, he describes a transition to a clean green economy. This is indeed an important part of our response. Many governments see it as part of a stimulus approach, spending on the kind of infrastructure that we'll need in the 21st century instead of more of the same. China and South Korea, perhaps the most ambitious examples. The US is doing likewise. But the UK's green investment package, compared with even the EU average, doesn't even make mid-table. What of the Scottish Government's response? I'm bound to point out that the remarks on energy efficiency in the Government's progress report are the mere remnants of a failed attempt by myself and my colleagues to persuade the Government to do the whole job for the whole of Scotland, something which would have cost something like £100 million per year for 10 years, compared with, it's less than the price of 1 mile of the M74. What we have instead is 15 million. At that rate, we'll barely finish half the task by 2050. But is this, even this, the beginning of a transformation? Should we welcome it in those terms? I'm afraid not. It's a supplement. Alongside that investment in the green alternative, in what should be transition or transformation, we see more of the same. Unnecessary roads, bridges, more coal-fired power stations, airport expansion. Every country is guilty of the same thing. I don't lay this entirely at the door of Mr Swinney. Even if green investment is being seen as part of a green stimulus, it is an attempt to stimulate the corpse of what went before, resurrecting a failed economic model, like Dr. Frankenstein applying a few volts to the severed frog's legs on the bench in front of him, seeing it twitch and crying out in triumph, "It's alive!" Well, it's not. The animal remains, in any real sense, a lifeless form. Is this metaphor intended to represent the Scottish economy? Am I saying that our economy is dead? No, of course not. But the notion of abolishing bust and having boom forever, the notion of everlasting growth, that's dead. The era of treating energy as a cheap commodity, that's over. And the persistent habit of human beings living beyond our means, both financially and ecologically, that habit must be killed off too. So what does economic recovery mean? Recovery. Recovery does not mean keeping a dying patient alive for one more day still in pain, still dependent on a life support system, in this case provided by the Treasury. It means treating the underlying sickness. An economic recovery plan for Scotland, which understood recovery as healing rather than reanimation, would have at its heart, I suggest, three key aspects. New ways of defining economic progress, including all of its impact on human life and our environment, not just growth, understanding that economy is a word which shares its roots with ecology and is about more than just money. Secondly, clear definitions of the social and ecological limits within which the economy must exist, and a sense of how private, public and third sectors can work together to achieve them. And thirdly, an all-out attack on the shallow and selfish values of consumerism. The age of me, more, greed and overconsumption must die if something more sustainable, something more human, is to be allowed to live. This would be recovery, Presiding Officer, and it means ending the futile attempt to resurrect the corpse of the 20th century.